guys, it's Sam, and today I'm talking most disappointing reads of 2021. Now this was, I wouldn't say this was necessarily hard, but it's not like any of these are like devastating because as I've talked about, my reading year was so just kind of like, that there wasn't a lot of like high highs or low lows. And I don't think any of these are gonna be particularly surprising for anybody, but I think I have eight. So let's get into it. And these are not in any order as far as like ranking best to worst or whatever. And also they're disappointing. It doesn't mean that they're bad. So there's a number of books on here that I liked, but I didn't like them as much as I thought I was going to. That is true for our first book, which is City of Stairs by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is the first book in a adult fantasy series that is more of a city-based fantasy. It's not an urban fantasy because that has a different vibe to it. But it's a fantasy in which the city is a very main component. And I couldn't even necessarily tell you the plot of this, to be honest. I remember pieces of it. Like I can sit here and envision certain scenes, but not what the overarching plot was. What I remember of it is that there's gods and those gods were kind of destroyed, and them being destroyed affected this like city in a bad way because the gods were kind of what was keeping the city so magnificent. And this is sort of like the after effects of that, like years in the future. But it's a lot of like gods and cities and technology and whatever. The reason this was disappointing isn't because it was bad or badly written, although I'm a little foggy on it, but that's kind of how 2021 was. It is more so that I love the Foundry Side series by Robert Jackson Bennett so much, and that whole series has been like a 5-star to like high 4 experience for me thus far, and this was just like a 3. I do plan on continuing with this series. I think that I overall will like it. I might have to reread this one though. Which I'm like, oh, boo. I don't necessarily love rereading books that I just feel kind of like about. Maybe it's supposed to be like an audiobook reread, but I do plan on continuing with this series. I like what it's doing thematically, but it just wasn't as good for me as Foundry Side was. Then we have one that'll be no shock to anyone that has heard me talk about it, and that is Lore by Alexandra Bracken. This is a standalone YA fantasy. I've done, I think, I might have not done a review, but we definitely talked about it for the House Salt Book Club because that was our pick for February. This was my, I think, only 1-star this year. Everything else that I wasn't liking, I either DNF'd or I got like a 2-star because I had something that was kind of redeemable. This was bad. It's sort of a current or like, you know, sort of contemporary fantasy following characters that are in sort of groups, cult type groups that need to kill the gods whenever they come down to earth every so often. So sort of like a Hunger Game with Greek gods situation. It could have been really cool. It was so bad. It didn't make a ton of sense overall plot-wise. It was pretty boring and pretty slow. I could not tell you any of the characters' names or their motivations. Character motivations didn't make sense, remember that. Even the Greek gods didn't make sense. Again, you can do a retelling of something and it doesn't need to be completely accurate, but even the direction Alexandra Bracken took it in wasn't very good. And this is ultimately the book that made me decide I am no longer reading any Alexandra Bracken. I have read a number of her series now. She is not an author for me. I've tried numerous books by her. She's not an author for me, and I'm done because this was her last chance and I'm done. Then A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. This is a very, very hyped book on Book Talk because it's a Hades Persephone retelling. Adult, it's like a fantasy romance, it's smutty, whatever. But I still thought it was gonna be good when I went into it. I was like, oh, this is gonna be like a 4 or 5-star based on how everyone's talking about it. When I went into it, I didn't hear anyone talk negatively about it. This book is bad. This book could have been a 1-star, honestly. Like, I did really contemplate going back and changing it to 1-star. There must have been something semi-redeemable about it, but it's been so long. I did talk about it in my Hades and Persephone vlog, so I will link that on the screen that I did back in like February, I think. This was poorly written, the plot was mediocre, the character motivations were bad, it relied entirely on like miscommunication. The Persephone character was horribly characterized. I just didn't like how they did her character. I didn't even really like how they did Hades, and Hades is like pretty easy to get right for me. It was just not good. And then the fact that it's a whole fucking series, are you kidding me? Like, it's not a standalone. There's multiple books in the series and I think it's still ongoing. Ugh. So yeah, no. And now whenever people recommend books by this author, I'm like, no. No, I will not. Then we have Incendiary by Zoraida Cordova. This is a first book, and I think it's probably a duology. It might be a trilogy. I think it's just duology. It's a YA fantasy duology that's basically like a magical Spanish Inquisition type setting. And our main character is sort of an outcast of both the magical group and then the religious persecution group, and gets kind of like wrapped up in a bunch of stuff. Again, something that I very barely remember. It would have been a 2-star for me. I had really high hopes because it sounds like a really cool premise, and I want to like Zoraida Cordova's stuff. She has another standalone, I think it's The Inheritance of something. I can see the cover, it has a woman on the cover and it's red. I'm thinking about reading that because I tend to hear sort of like mixed things about her stuff, but like generally positive, and this just like did not work for me. I even got sent the second book from the publisher randomly because I'm like, you know I didn't like the first book, right? And I was thinking about reading it because the end was like kind of promising, but ultimately no, I'm not gonna do it. So yeah, mediocre for me. Then, such a disappointment for me, Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Ugh. This is a adult, technically historical fiction. I know when you say something set in the 80s, people are like, historical fiction. It's technically historical. The 80s was a while ago now, guys. And this takes place in her sort of like companion-y type world, because they're not companion books, but this book does feature a character that was in the other two as a minor character. Her other two, Daisy Jones and the Six, and The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. And it follows like that character's kids. And I liked the themes of this book just fine. The execution, I think, was poor. This was another House Salt Book Club pick that we read, so I also think I did a review of it, but if I didn't, I'll put the book club on the screen. But what I didn't like about this was the way that it was sort of split into two, it wasn't split into two books completely, but it felt like two separate books. And the way that was combined, I didn't really like because it felt very jarring, and I actually preferred if the second part of the book was like the full book and it was more expanded on, because when I saw the synopsis, I thought this is going to be kind of focused on this one night and all these party goers and things like that, and this was much more of like a generational story, which I don't tend to like, but just wasn't what I was thinking I was getting into. And then I just found the characters just like very forgettable. And what I like about Taylor Jenkins Reid's other books, man, that was a hard sentence to say, that I've read thus far, is I really like her character work. And so to have the characters being just like kind of mediocre for me and just like tied more into the themes and stuff, it was just kind of like eh. So I ended up not liking this one. I will continue to read Taylor Jenkins Reid's books though. Then Well Matched by Jen DeLuca. This was still pretty decent for me. I think I rated this like a 4 stars. It's probably like a 3.5 honestly in hindsight. But this was one of my highly anticipated books for the year. I love Jen DeLuca's Well Met, and this is in that companion series. It all takes place around a Ren Fair. It's an adult contemporary romance kind of companion series. I didn't like the second book in the series, but I had high hopes for the third book, which was this one, since the first one came out, because this couple is teased in that book. And I didn't like this as much as I wanted to. I think Mitch as a love interest is awesome, but our female lead is just like so sort of like obtusely closed off in a way that didn't really make sense. A lot of the things we thought we were gonna get as far as like tropes and stuff and like fake dating, like a lot of that was sort of resolved a little bit too quickly. Like it just didn't have the execution of the tropes in the way that I thought it was going to, and then the couple didn't have really enough chemistry for me. Mitch is like a perfect boyfriend, so I would date him, honestly. Send me a himbo like that, please, universe. But as far as like their dynamic, I pulled from them at times, but like they haven't stuck with me in a way that I thought they were going to based on the first book. Then this one pains me, and it might change during reread, but I'm not sure. That is Witch Shadow by Susan Dennard. This was still a good book for me. It was a 4 star, but I've read the rest of the books in the Witchland series 5 stars. I love them all. And all of them have stuck with me throughout the year and the years. And this one just didn't. I don't know if it's because I was at the sort of like end of my reading slump when I was reading this, and so like a lot of this book is just foggy memory, and that I'll like it more on reread, but it just didn't resonate as much as I wanted it to. I'm not going to go into spoilers obviously for this, but I do have a review and stuff up for it. But there are characters that we followed previously that we weren't following here for various reasons, and I missed those character POVs and stuff. It didn't have quite as much of a bang as I wanted it to. So yeah, again, I think as a whole this series is still amazing, and I'm you know, this wasn't bad. It was just not 5 stars like the rest of the series has been, which was sad for me. And lastly, we have one that I'm still kind of actively mad about, and that is Always in December. This is the fault of the like marketing team at the time that I read it. This was advertised as romance. I found it in the romance section of NetGalley. I don't look in any other section on NetGalley. It was one of the last romance books that I read last year, and it was advertised as a two ships passing in the night romance, even though that it said that it had some like angst and stuff in it. I can still have an angsty romance as well, as long as it ends in a good way, and especially with ships in the night. If they're going to be ships in the night, where that trope is basically two people who cross paths at the beginning of the story and then separate for whatever reason, and then keep sort of like intersecting over like long periods of time until they finally get together. For that to be fulfilling for me, they have to get together. This is not a romance book. Okay, so the happily ever after is not ensured. And in fact, the way that this ended ruined everything else for me, because it basically like made all of the earlier sort of suffering like kind of not worth it. And it's a romantic tragedy more than anything else, which is not what it was advertised as at the time. Since I read this, there have been some things changed, like the genre and stuff on I think both NetGalley when I last checked and Amazon are now women's fiction. But when I read it, it was not that way. And so basically I went in expecting like a ships passing in the night sort of centered around Christmas story, which is similar to one of my favorite books I've ever read, which is One Day in December by Josie Silver. And this was not that. And I was completely betrayed by this story. But that is it for my most disappointing reads for 2021. Comment below, let me know some of your most disappointing reads. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.